I'm Giulio Pugliese. I'm a departmental lecturer in Oxford at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies and part-time professor at the Robert Schuman Center's Global Governance program, where we just inaugurated this EU-Asia project together with Canenda. And this is going to be the concluding panel of this launching event that will translate also into policy papers that will be churned out. We are delighted for those of you who have been very patient in following this marathon mega event up until now, for you to have made it to the final panel. And we hope to be up to standards, and I'm certain that we will be up to the high standards so far. And the conversation that will be led today in this final panel will follow very much in continuity with that of the previous two panels. We will deal with connectivity on one hand, but this time closer to home. We will deal with connectivity in Europe, and we will deal with China's economic presence in Europe. And if the previous panel has had speakers stressing out that China has outmaneuvered the United States in the Asia Pacific, well, Japan in the past 2 years, if not much earlier, has really beefed up its game in so-called economic statecraft. And so we will see what has been also Japan's response to China's moves within the Asia Pacific. And so without further ado, let me introduce you the speakers and discussants for this panel. We have Francesca Ghiretti from the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, where I also happen to be senior fellow. And Francesca is a close and keen watcher and an up-and-coming scholar on China's foreign policy, and especially China-Europe relations. We have Dr. Ugo Meyer, CNRS Research Fellow at Sciences Po, Center for International Studies. And we also have Professor Akira Igata from the Center for Rulemaking Strategy at Tama University. And he will talk on something that he has also been closely involved. So this is great for having well-informed, but also presentations, not just on the academic front, but from people at the forefront of the subjects that we're talking with. And to cap it all, we have Liselotte Odgaard, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, who has been a keen watcher on Europe-China relations, particularly in recent years on the technological and economic security front. And it is a great fit to have Francesca dealing with China's presence in Southern and Central European and Eastern economies in Europe, and have then Ugo actually deal with Europe's response to China's economic presence in the big three countries, the UK, France, and Germany, so Europe writ large in the geographical sense. And then we bring it all back to the Asia Pacific with a study really of Japan's approach and response to China's economic presence, if not also in coordination and perhaps with differences vis-a-vis the US. I'll leave it here. Be reminded that you have 10 minutes with some Italian flexibility. But not too much, please. And the floor is Francesca's floor, and then we will go in the order that is written down in the program. Francesca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Giulio. Thank you to all the speakers and to UI for inviting me. I'll try, although I'm Italian, I'll try to stick to the 10 minutes, like proper 10 minutes, I promise. I'll be speaking a little bit about, as Giulio said, the BRI in Southern and Central Eastern Europe. what I'll be saying today actually builds on what I've been working on for my PhD, but also researches that we've been doing at IAI on the BRI more broadly. And I've decided to focus on the original aspect of the BRI rather than, trying to look into what the BRI has become through the years, the different declination, different identities that it has taken. So it would be about infrastructure and connectivity, and in particular the three sectors of energy, transportation, and telecommunication. This latter sector will be marginalized in this presentation for two reasons. A little bit because it has been at the center of the conversation as far as 5G is concerned, so it's politically loaded. It has a lot of variables that don't necessarily have much to do with the BRI itself, and also because what I've realized while I was looking into the case studies that I'm going to introduce now in a moment is that they don't really have particular traits. They share a lot of common traits with other European countries as far as 5G and telecommunication is concerned, because it's more at company level rather than at country level. So it will be mainly about energy and transportation during this presentation. So far, there are 17 European Union member states that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, if we look at content, we could argue that a lot more European member states are part of the BRI in terms of investments in infrastructure and connectivity that are very similar to those in countries that are members of the BRI. Of course, this does not mean that they are member of the BRI, because there's not the political will, not the political endorsement of the project. So a difference is indeed there. It's just to say, content-wise, it's not always clear where the border is between those that are part of the BRI and those that are not part of the BRI. Focusing on these two geographical areas, Southern and Eastern Europe, has been a decision made on the basis of the fact that these are areas of major concerns, usually. Southern Europe, because mainly of the maritime hubs that it possesses, and Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe because of, well, quite frankly, because of the format of the 17+1, the idea that, there was a bit of disintegration within the European Union caused by this format. And the 6 case studies that I've selected in Southern Europe are Greece, Italy, and Portugal. And because of the number of BRI members in Southern Europe cases are more widely represented than Eastern European cases. And in Eastern Europe is Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. Before starting to look at these cases, and I promise I'm going to stay in the 10 minutes, I just wanted to raise the attention on an element which is often mentioned as being particularly important for the relationship between the European Union and China, and that is the global financial crisis and the following euro crisis. Of course, we know this had a massive impact on the development of China globally and also of the relationship between the European Union and China, but for the two geographical areas that we're looking at today, these had even a starker impact in Central and Eastern Europe, because these were already relatively weak economies who paid the price of the euro crisis and the financial crisis, but even more so in Southern Europe, the euro crisis meant having to start a series of privatization processes that often ended up in Chinese enterprises acquiring shares of previously public assets. So I think this is particularly important to bear in mind. And then, of course, we need to remember that soon after the euro crisis, China involvement economically into the European Union was very much welcomed, not just by the countries, but also by the European Union. Even China's involvement in Greece was very much welcomed by the Eurogroup itself. And then the situation started to change. I won't dwell too much on the process of, how the perception and the view has changed and why, but we get to a point around the mid-2010s, late mid-2010s, in which the perception kind of changes, and also the response to China in the European Union at different speeds changes. And as far as Eastern and Central European countries are concerned, the countries under analysis all joined the BRI relatively early in 2015. But we must remember that they were part of the 16+1 since 2012, so even before the launch of the BRI itself. And this explains why a large number of the deals and agreements and investments that came into these countries predate the joining into the BRI, even though the joining was quite early on in 2015. And even more interestingly is the fact that the amount and number of investments in Central and Eastern Europe is extremely limited. So despite the entire, politically loaded worry because of the 17+1, because of the fact that these were latecomers in the European Union and a series of other factors, the reality of things is that Chinese investments in these areas are extremely limited. Often they have the objective of market access rather than properly infrastructural and connectivity development. And in the areas that I mentioned, the only so first of all, Czech Republic, basically nothing. There was talk of, the development of a nuclear plant, but it didn't materialize. In Poland, a dry port and rail hub was developed and originally was meant to include funding from Chinese counterparts, but in the end it has been funded by the European Union. And I can't really pronounce the name of the place. I think it's something like Sławków. I don't speak Poland, so I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced. Sorry, Polish. And of course, then you have Hungary. And Hungary is the great exception because it's the only country who has received or will receive a loan from a Chinese entity. Normally in the European Union, China moves through investments, although we know that in other regions, the BRI is developed via loans. And this is for the Budapest-Belgrade railway. We know it has undergone a series of obstacles. We're not quite sure whether it actually materialized, but the most recent news is that yes, it will happen, the section that is in Hungary, and that the loan will be received from China. And then, of course, Hungary is also an exception because you have a flagship BRI project, which lacks in the other examples that I brought. And then we're quickly moving on to Southern European countries. These joined later on to the BRI, so Portugal and Greece in 2018 and Italy in 2019. And so it shouldn't be surprising that most of the agreements and even most of the flagship projects happened before these years. If we think about the port of Piraeus, it had been in the pipelines for a while, but you have the official 51% shares going to Costco in 2016, which is before the 2018. And the same goes for the terminal of Vado Ligure in Italy, started in 2016, not after 2019. So all of these you can see are before joining the BRI. And then you have potentially one exception, which is the port of Sines in Portugal. We'll know who this terminal for to whom the public tender for the new terminal, the new container terminal in Sines will go in April, so we don't know yet. But the information we have so far is that the only credible bidder at the moment are two Chinese enterprises. And here you have the most one of the most notable elements of China's presence in infrastructure and connectivity in Europe, which is often during these privatization processes, China was the only bidder. So there was no alternative or no serious alternative. And we see now in the port of Sines, it might be the same situation. The Port Authority has been calling for other potential bidders, but there's not been much of a response so far. And finally, I just want to highlight two more things. One, the Port of Piraeus is still an exception because you don't have many other examples of majority of a Chinese enterprise having majority shares of a whole port or of a whole infrastructure project as big as that one. And then finally, we need to have a thought about politics, but I know I'm running out of time, so perhaps I'll touch upon these during the question sessions, or, or I'll never touch upon this. So summing up is a matter of, understanding whether projects that were agreed upon before joining the BRI and then afterwards labeled as BRI are actually BRI, or is just, an aftermath labeling which is useful. And then finally, whether, we can complain about these projects when there are no alternatives, and when the alternative might be just not developing an infrastructural connectivity project at all. Thank you.
Shall I?
Giulio, you're muted.
It was unmuted by IT guys. That is the high consideration they have of me. Thank you, Francesca. This was a perfect pitch, actually, and perfectly complementary to what we will hear from Dr. Maya, because Francesca has just given us a sense of the Chinese inroads in hard infrastructure, especially port infrastructure, and how this has eventually been followed through by memoranda of understanding that do not necessarily hint at like big dependency on China, nor do they hint necessarily at big Chinese influence. What is interesting is that Dr. Maya's presentation will in fact deal with the prime recipients of Chinese outward investment, which interestingly enough are non-BRI signatories. And so perhaps there could be a different kind of also of relationship there. And what is interesting is that the focus of this talk that you will hear in a second will also be beyond hard infrastructure, and we'll touch upon the digital infrastructure and the dual use components and the dual use side to these investments, which is much more readily evident in these particular side of Chinese economic engagement in Europe. So without further ado, Dr. Maya, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation, Julian. Very good to be here with the fellow co-panelists. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yes, okay, great. So what I'm going to present today is essentially a very short summary of a book that I'm currently writing, which is titled Awakening to China's Rise, European Foreign and Security Policy Toward the People's Republic of China, which is going to be published by Oxford University Press at the end of this year, hopefully. So the starting point is for the book and the talk is the following: the reemergence of China in world politics and the ongoing rising US-China competition have marked the return of great power rivalry in the 21st century. And so in this context, how to grapple with China's rise is bound to become a, if not the defining feature of transatlantic relations in the years to come. And so the question I look at in this book is how Europe's three major powers, so France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, have responded to the national security challenges posed by the rise of China. So the book essentially is structured in two parts. The first one looks at how the big three have confronted China's growing assertiveness in the Asia-Pacific through diplomatic and security initiatives, bilateral, unilateral, multilateral, and also naval deployments. And I should add that the time period covered is 1989 to the present. The second section of the book, which is what I'm going to discuss today, is how they have responded to China's growing assertiveness in Europe through greater foreign direct investments, which was what we just heard in the previous presentation, which indeed is a very good complement, and also through the growing involvement of Chinese companies in the digital infrastructure in Europe. So all the question of 5G, Huawei, and ZTE. So the sources I rely upon are 135 interviews that I conducted mostly in Berlin, Paris, Brussels, and London, but also in New Delhi, Seoul, and Washington, DC, archival declassified documents, WikiLeaks cable gates, and data on naval deployments. Okay, so the central arguments of the book, and this applies both to the Asia-Pacific and to Europe, is that China's growing assertiveness in the past decades, since the 2000s essentially, has sparked a wake-up call among the big three to the security implication of China rise. So whereas economic interests have provided the underlying impetus for the big three drawing attention to Asia, to China, security consideration and specifically threat perception have been the key driver of change in their foreign policy toward Beijing in the past decade. So in the 1990s and 2000s, they have all had low threat perceptions of China and rising economic interests. And therefore, the big three looked at China primarily through economic lenses, not only, but primarily. In the past decade, because of mounting concerns vis-a-vis China in the diplomatic, security, and economic fields, this has caused a hardening of their policy goals in their China policy, which have translated in the formulation of new policy instruments to confront such challenge. And so China is today perceived increasingly not only as an economic opportunity, as it used to be, but also as a national security challenge. And so in a nutshell, as a result of Beijing growing assertiveness in Asia, in Europe, and beyond, the major European powers have awakened to the security challenge posed by the rise of China. So if we look at Europe, if we look at Europe, in the 1990s and 2000s, the big three really looked at China as a distant emerging market, which posed very few security challenges. I can go into the details and explain which ones, but essentially it posed few security challenges. It's in the last decade that we've seen rising concern, again, in the economic, political, and security domains. So in the economic domain, and this is more continuity than change, in fact, but there have been growing concerns over the lack of reciprocity. So the use of discriminatory measures on market access, investments, on the restriction on European investments in China, of course, a long-standing issue of forced technology transfers and intellectual property rights, the distortion of market mechanism, and also state-guided takeovers of European high-tech companies, while at the same time protecting the Chinese industry against foreign investments. So this is in the economic domain. In the security domain, you have several areas of concern. First of all is the foreign direct investments by Chinese companies in sensitive sectors and its growing role in the supply chain for the critical infrastructure. So the concern, and this is again based on a large number of interviews, is that Chinese companies could siphon advanced dual use technology, acquire strategic assets in Europe critical infrastructure, be it energy, communication, robotics, defense-related technology, and potentially hinder the security of supply in the civilian dual use or military domain. So these are major areas of concerns. And then there is the very much discussed role of Chinese companies in telecommunications equipment, on 5G, also the concerns on Huawei predates 5G. There are many concerns also vis-a-vis its role in 4G technology. But essentially, there are two areas of concern. One is specifically related to Huawei and one specifically related to 5G as a technology. First of all, Huawei is a source of concern because of its opaque ownership structure, its supposed ties with the Chinese Communist Party and intelligence services, and of course, the China 2017 intelligence law, which compels companies in China to support, provide assistance, or cooperate in national intelligence work. Then with 5G, the concern is that there are specific technological features of the 5G networks which increase the overall attack surface and the number of potential entry points for attackers. And therefore, the main area of concern is that through cyber attacks, like the installation of backdoors, Chinese-related entities could spy over data flows or disrupt parts of the digital infrastructure. And then you have political concerns. A major area of concern is that the deepening economic foothold of China on the European continent has provided political leverage for Beijing to exploit the existing divisions among Europeans. This has been the case for instance, investment through the 17+1 mechanism and the BRI, which we just heard about. So these rising concerns have translated in a hardening of policy goals. So essentially, in the first 2 decades of the post-Cold War, I'll be brief on that, but there were 3 main policy goals: expanding economic interest, broadening diplomatic engagement in order to integrate China in the international system, and thereby also enable domestic political reform and economic reform in China. In the last decade, these rising concerns have translated in a hardening of the policy goals, which today France, Germany, and the EU define as a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. The UK recently defines China as a systemic rival too. And a big important area has been that in the past decade, there have been growing cooperation to sort of seek greater intra-European cohesion and unity, to have better leverage vis-a-vis China, but also to develop an autonomous position at national and EU level within this rising US-China competition. And of course, one has to factor in Brexit, and I can discuss that in detail later. The final point is that these hardening policy goals vis-a-vis China have translated in new policy instruments. And so you've seen the strengthening of national EU screening mechanism on foreign direct investments, and growing restrictions on 5G suppliers of concern like Huawei. So the interesting thing here is that states have balanced complex consideration on the security side, how to avoid Huawei from entering 5G networks through what I said before, the backdoors, but also the economic cost of removing and replacing Huawei has been a major consideration, and the foreign policy challenge of juggling between US pressure and Chinese pressure. And so they have all established more stringent restrictions, and the UK subsequently established a full-blown ban, largely because of US pressures, but not only, also because of changes in US export controls, and I can get into that in more details. So the bottom line is that China's global assertiveness has sparked an awakening of Europe's major powers and vis-a-vis the security implications of China rise. However, I would like to point out in conclusion, despite this awakening and convergence between the big 3, still you see a lot of fragmentation across the European Union because of diverging threat perceptions and diverging interests. And therefore, despite this convergence, the EU remains divided in the face of a rising China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive talk, and I already sense that there are also divergent point of views between, for instance, Francesca's earlier analysis about the real essence in terms of political leverage behind Chinese engagement, economic engagement through fora such as the 17+1 fora or BRI MOUs. And one point that you touched upon by the end of your presentation, and also in a sense, to a lesser extent in the writing that you sent us, is that yes, US pressure did play a role, but it would be interesting for all of us to see, perhaps in the Q&A session, what role did US and does US economic statecraft play in changing also the cost-benefit analysis of engaging with, say, for instance, Chinese technology? Because of course, export restrictions and export controls aim also at rendering the Chinese technology substandard. And so it's not just about the security implications of implanting Huawei components, but also the fact that Huawei cannot get US semiconductors, right? And so by making Huawei less appealing, what role does US pressure play in that calculation? And this is a question for the European side, but also perhaps on the Japanese side, which we are delighted to have Akira Igata talk about. Igata-san will also engage in a similarly comprehensive presentation, and we are all ears. Thank you. On the Japanese side, looking forward to it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Akira Igata, and I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Rulemaking Strategies, which is a policy think tank affiliated with Tama University here in Tokyo. And I want to thank the host, Endo Sensei, and especially my friend, Giulio, for inviting me to what has so far been a superb international conference. Now, I want to begin my presentation with the caveat that my remarks are made in my private capacity and do not reflect the views of any of the institutions that I am affiliated with. And I feel the need to emphasize this point whenever I give any presentation these days, since I am also affiliated with international organizations, Japanese politicians, bureaucracy, academia, and the private sector in various capacities. Also, full disclosure, I have been personally involved in many of the bureaucratic restructuring and new policies related to economic statecraft here in Japan that I describe in my paper. So there is a good chance that my views are biased in favor of being quite favorable to these recent Japanese developments. And last administrative note, in lieu of using PowerPoint slides, I will have my two cats roaming around in the background. So please watch and enjoy them if my presentation sounds bland and your mind starts to wander around. So to start, my paper is titled Japan's Burgeoning Economic Security Strategy, Navigating Amidst the US-China Competition. In this paper, I argue that while Prime Minister Abe's security policies and his active diplomacy have been rigorously analyzed, there has been relatively less attention paid to the rise of economic statecraft within Japan's foreign policy and national security calculus that was begun during the last few years of the Abe administration. While this new emphasis is relatively less understood both within Japan and among its allies and partners, I argue that this has the potential to be as, if not more, important and impactful than Prime Minister Abe's other changes. In the first section, I argue that Japan has been walking the tightrope between the US and China, given the relative rise of China in recent years. While there are no doubts about the strengths of Japan-US bilateral alliance, there is actually a surprising lack of a consistent and coherent China strategy in Japan. This divergence in views cannot be simply explained away as, say, a certain ministry being more pro-China and the other. These splits are evident throughout the political parties and bureaucracy. Despite this lack of clear direction in its China policies, I argue in the second section that Japan has recently awakened to other dimensions of the national security challenge, particularly those that address economic security and advanced technology. Perhaps the most important change was the establishment of the Economic Division at the National Security Secretariat. Previously, there had been 6 divisions here, but none of them focused on economic statecraft. The preparatory office of the Economic Division was set up with a limited number of personnel in October 2019 to create a 7th division that focuses on economic statecraft and emerging technologies. This division has since grown to staff of about 20 people following its launch in April 2020, which has made it the largest of the 7 NSS units. The FY 2021 budget request by the Cabinet Secretariat includes a further increase of 4 full-time staff at the NSS, all of whom will be working at this economic division. This division is providing direction to and coordination throughout the Japanese government, including divisions that focus on technology and economic security that were recently set up in different ministries to accommodate the restructuring of the NSS. They include the Emerging Security Challenges Division, later renamed the Economic Security Policy Division at MOFA, the Economic Security Division at METI, and various new positions, including the Economic Security Information Planning Officer post at the Ministry of Defense, which will be set up in FY 2021. A similar development is also underway in the intelligence community. The Second Foreign Affairs Division of the Public Security Bureau at the Metropolitan Police Department used to focus on both China and North Korea. In the first restructuring in almost 2 decades, this division will, from April 2021, be split into 2. The new second division will not only focus on China, but it will also get an increase in personnel. This change is reportedly prompted by the need for Japan to strengthen responses to China's increasing intelligence gathering activities, industrial espionage, and other means of illicit technology transfers of high-tech and emerging technologies. The Public Security Intelligence Agency is also actively raising awareness of risks related to economic security, especially illicit transfers of emerging technologies to the private sector and academia by engaging Keidanren, the Federation of Japanese Industry Groups, and universities. In the third section of the paper, I explain how, in addition to these organizational changes, Japan is sharpening other defensive tools of economic statecraft through new legislations and policies. For instance, Japan responded to concerns about rising levels of Chinese investment by revising the Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act, by lowering the threshold of regulatory approval for foreign investments from 10% of a company's share to 1%. The government has also been discussing for years about the creation of a law that restricts acquisition of land relevant to national security by foreign entities. But Prime Minister Suga finally announced in January 2021 that he will submit legislation that allows the government to receive information on ownership and use of land from various ministries and municipalities that allows them to acquire a better understanding of the problem. The Japanese government has adopted other defensive economic security policies as well. It has banned the use of high-risk vendors in government telecommunication networks. It is providing incentives for the development of secure networks and supporting a Made in Japan alliance for 5G network infrastructure, equipment, and base stations. METI created guidance for Japanese universities to develop policies to control the use and the export of nuclear, radar, and other high-level technologies with military uses. There are also various ongoing developments, such as creation of a Japanese version of a RAND corporation, or the establishment of a new security clearance system for the private sector, or a secret patent system, inclusion of economic security as a pillar in the new upcoming national security strategies, and more, which I explain in detail in the paper. In the fourth section, I argue that the drivers of these changes are actually coming from the politicians, not the bureaucracy. The strategic headquarters on the creation of a new international order, a grandiose name for a function within the LDP Policy Research Council, last December published a document titled Towards the Establishment of an Economic Security Strategy. This document recommends that Japan focus on 16 policies related to economic security, such as diversifying and increasing resilience of supply chains, fostering innovation and maintaining technological advantage, and strengthening food security, in addition to many of the initiatives mentioned above. This awakening among politicians to the importance of economic security is not limited to the ruling LDP. A non-partisan parliamentary group with members from almost all major political parties called Japan Parliamentary Alliance on China, or JPAC, was established as a counterpart to the Multinational Interparliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC, in July 2020. JPAC has been pushing for the creation of new tools to deal with challenges posed by China, many of which concerns economic statecraft. One of their primary initiatives so far has been the creation of a Japanese version of what is called the Magnitsky Act, which will give the Japanese government a new tool to invoke economic sanctions against egregious human rights violations around the world. Other initiatives include strengthening human rights due diligence of global supply chains by Japanese companies, and stipulating the need for Japan to strengthen economic security policies based on human rights principles with the new national security strategy. And once again, full disclosure, I am an economic security advisor to IPAC, and in that capacity, I have been supporting JPAC with many of these initiatives. Japan's business sector is beginning to accommodate this new mentality as well. Japanese companies with global reach from various industries have been setting up corporate divisions to better incorporate economic security developments into their planning. Most notable is Mitsubishi Electric, which has announced in September 2020 the creation of the Corporate Economic Security Division, which is in charge of, and I quote, researching and analyzing the rapidly changing economic security policies and legal systems of countries worldwide, end quote. In sections 5 and 6, I argue that while economic statecraft or economic security are not explicitly used in discussions of the free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, they are very much embedded in thinking and policies behind FOIP. I also argue here that Japan used to be a rule taker in international politics, but it's starting to become a rule maker, and that under FOIP, Japan can play a more aggressive role in creating international standards and rules in the areas such as cybersecurity, smart cities, data security, and HADR. I will spare you of the details in this presentation since I'm sure everyone here is very much aware of the developments surrounding FOIP. In the last section, I give 6 tangible recommendations for further bolstering Japan's economic statecraft through international cooperation. Since I'm about to end my time, I will quickly just name 6 of them. First, Japan should create a Japan-US Economic Security Consultative Committee. Second, Japan should establish an economic security version of the Shangri-La Dialogue. Third, Japan, along with US and Australia, should double down on the Blue Dot Network. 4, Japan, along with other democracies, should cooperate to reduce dependence on authoritarian countries. 5, Japan, again, along with other democratic countries, should develop deterrent economic statecraft capacities. And lastly, Japan should try and foster economic recovery and innovation. As evident in what I described through this presentation, Japan's embrace of economic statecraft opens up numerous new possibilities for future cooperation between Japan and the world. I hope to continue to play a primary role in both advocating and implementing changes here in Japan. I look forward to your questions and continued engagement in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Igata. I think we have a perfect fit between the 3 presentations. If I may, just a second, throw some questions, in a sense, quick one for Igata-san to consider. It would be interesting, and you seem to be particularly fairly convinced about the camp where Japan should align with, which is techno-democracies, to use Secretary of State Blinken's word. But when is it, for instance, that some of Biden's initiatives, and this echoes the previous comment I made to Dr. Meyer, when is it that, for instance, some of America's, United States, more ambitious policies, such as supply relocation, for instance, and there is an executive order that has just started a 100-day review about critical supply chain relocations. When is it that, for instance, a more marked type of decoupling won't necessarily fit Japanese interests, if at all? And this brings me to the discussant. Liselotte Odgaard is the she is tightly connected with the EU-Asia project because she was the author of the first policy paper from our project, which I invite you all to download. It's open access and it's titled Europe and the US-China Tech War, Enhanced Competition in the Post-Trump Era, and she was right on the mark. Her crystal ball worked. Clearly, the Biden administration has been particularly aggressive in its early policies vis-a-vis China in a fairly consistent, you could say, way, if more polite way compared to the Trump administration. And before I leave the floor to Liselotte Odgaard, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, I invite you all to take advantage of this opportunity to type in your questions and comments. You can also do so anonymously if you prefer. But I would encourage you to type in your questions. Liselotte, the floor is yours for what I imagine will be fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulio, for giving me the opportunity to comment on these 3 very timely and interesting papers on the challenges from China's Belt and Road met by Europe and Japan. I will start with Francesca's paper. The topic of the paper, the Belt and Road in Southern and Eastern Europe, is very timely since lately we've seen growing resistance towards the Chinese initiative in this part of Europe. And I guess the broader question would be how much such resistance matters in the long run. Will the 17+1 cease to be an important Chinese inroad into Europe? Or the opposite, there's a lot of interesting data and analysis in this paper. And I think that makes it an important part of the debate on Europe-China relations. But just to raise some issues for you to consider, one thing I thought when I read it is that you argue that relations between China and the EU countries have cooled. But would it be more correct to say that they're changing? Because after all, economic and financial interdependence between the two sides looks set to continue to be strong, and Europe continues to demonstrate a preference for working with China on fleshing out rules of engagement that will permit them to continue to develop their economic and financial relations. Lately, that was witnessed by the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investments. So if you could address that, please. Another issue I thought of as I read your paper is what constitutes Chinese influence, actually, in your view? Because you could argue that you also point out that the fact that China refrains from pursuing some things, like trying to force Huawei's 5G onto some countries, for example, maybe due to tactical considerations that it's better to wait this one out and concentrate on making headway in less publicized but equally important sectors such as, I don't know, engine manufacturing, shipbuilding, other areas. So what I wanted to ask you is it more important to look at China's strategic positioning, the fact that it has gained an impressive foothold across strategic sectors and can activate this foothold for political purposes at a later date, even if sometimes its actual, significance or influence is not that as great as some people think it is? And a third point I'd like to ask you is that you point out that and you mentioned that in your talk, that in the case of the Portuguese port of Sines, China seems to be the only country interested in bidding for the management contract. And you can actually see that elsewhere sometimes, that China plugs in where no one else wants to go across the world, it leads me to the question, if you see, is Europe aware of that? Are they addressing that issue, do you think? And if not, is there a need for more mechanisms to control Chinese acquisition of strategic assets? In your opinion, is it good enough what we have, or is it insufficient? And should Europe be more aware that they need to get active in these biddings? Hugo Meyer, you have, I think I've only read the introduction so far, but it seems a promising, much needed and detailed analysis of Europe's response to China's growing economic, industrial, and technological influence in the UK, in France, and in Germany. And that directly brings me to one of my questions, because how representative would you say that the cases you look at are? The UK, Paris, Berlin. How much do they tell us about Europe's relations with China? We've seen Brexit occur, and that certainly seemed to push the remaining EU countries together and deal with the UK en bloc. In Germany, we see a CDU, Merkel's party, that seems to be weaker and weaker and may not be able to hold on to power. So there are some developments, I would say, in some of these countries, also in France, that means that they may not necessarily define as much as they have in the past what goes on in Europe. A lot of talk has been about the German-French engine, and that they drive a lot of things in Europe. But do you consider that to be fair assessment, or how do you see these three powers compared to all the other member states? And then I also wanted to ask you, how do you define what constitutes Chinese influence, like I asked Francesca? Because when you read the introduction, it looks like China has got a really good grip on these countries and has penetrated many sectors. But like Francesca's paper points out, looking at other countries, China's influence through its investments may be more limited than we sometimes think if we investigate China's acquisitions and behavior in detail. So I just wanted you to address how you see that. And then in your talk, you mentioned the European mechanisms that allows countries to better protect themselves against unsolicited Chinese practices. And while these mechanisms are voluntary, they certainly play an important role in the EU's claim to deal with, the problems that are coming out of China. But how effective do you see these mechanisms as being? Do they actually allow Europe to push back against China, or are they more sort of dressing on the cake that makes Europe look good and makes it look like it's actually doing something, but in reality, nothing happens and Europe goes on to have fairly large economic and financial dealings with China? And then finally, Professor Akira Igata, I think you've written a very insightful paper that describes, all the main points about Japan's economic statecraft vis-a-vis illicit Chinese industrial, financial, and economic practices. But I also have a few questions for you. And a similar one as the one I asked Hugo, there's, quite a few of the initiatives that you described that Japan has taken that are similar to those taken in Europe to try to deal with illicit Chinese economic, industrial, and financial practices. Can you comment on some of the similarities and differences here between Europe and Japan, and how effective do you think these measures are going to be that Japan adopts? How does it compare to Europe's effort? And secondly, you mentioned the question of human rights, and you argue that Japan is coming around to recognize that it must also defend human rights against Chinese crackdowns on these. But it seems to me that one of the US's main challenges in addressing human rights concerns is that sometimes it finds itself pretty much alone in this. There's often a lack of real support from Asian powers on this issue, and also from democracies such as Japan and Indonesia, at least in the past. So do you see that as changing towards more, if you like, offensive human rights policies in Japan, and perhaps also in neighboring states? And finally, you do focus, I think, a lot on Japan's relations with the US and other Asian powers in your paper and how they should be strengthened. But I would like to ask you, how important do you see links between Europe and Japan to be encountering Chinese challenges to a free and open Indo-Pacific and so on. After all, Japan has a comprehensive strategic partnership with Europe and a comprehensive free trade agreement. Does that matter? Does it make a difference? And how does that factor into Japan's policies on this? So thank you. Those were my comments so far.
Thank you, Lisa. We will go in the same order of the presentations, and I encourage everybody to throw additional questions and comments at the speakers. Thank you. Francesca.
Thank you. So I feel like I have 4 questions rather than 3. It's okay now. It's perfect. In terms of the growing resistance, in terms of this country's response to China, I have a feeling that is a sentiment and an approach that has been developing through the years. So it's not something momentarily. And I think that is the result of 3 main things. One is the US re-engagement with these areas, like active re-engagement with these countries. The second element is a decision of these countries to go back and align with the European position, and in part is also thanks to the debate that has been developing through the years regarding European position towards China. We must remember, thank God, in Europe we still have an open and free debate on these matters, and often these debates have an influence. And the last element is the disappointment that these countries have towards what was meant to be a great amount of Chinese capital and investments pouring in this country, promise of projects and again investments that never really materialized. This is quite common. It's not just in Eastern and Southern Europe. It's actually much more common throughout the world. So in terms of growing resistance, I'm not quite sure whether the 17+1 framework will disappear or it will become marginalized. But what I can tell is that the sentiment within the framework has changed. So until none of these variables that I've mentioned will change, I don't think that this will also improve. Regarding the second question, yeah, I mean, sure, the relations is changing. When I use the word cooling, I meant that they're less enthusiastic than they used to be. They're much more pragmatic, they're much more cool-headed in terms of trying to realize what we can do to safeguard European interests, safeguard our country's interests. And this is the result of an increased knowledge of each other, basically. These countries have got to know China better, have got to know how China acts better and vice versa. And this is kind of cooled, if I can use the term. Again, speaking of these things after yesterday is a bit complicated, because after yesterday you would say, well, no, the relationship has cooled because of the recent sanctions and and the response from China. And I think I'm not quite sure it's the day after, and you always have this sentiment, this feeling that because of that the approach is going to change. It might not be the case, but yeah, that's why I used cool, by the way. And what constitutes Chinese influence? I think Chinese influence has always been twofold. So one is like voluntary influence, and one is a sort of involuntary influence. In terms of involuntary influence, we've seen many instances in the past, which is basically the country itself that decides to preemptively act in a positive way towards China, or to please China in order to attract a better relationship and then more capital from China. And perhaps that is something that is not that much common anymore. And then you have the voluntary influence, which perhaps is a bit more like leverage than influence. And I think that we've seen, generally speaking, that China has been keener in the past few months to use that type of influence, to be more explicit. And of course, if you do have a foothold in some strategic assets within a country, that becomes indeed a risk. But the caveat is, if China decides to use that type of leverage explicitly, then it sends a very explicit signal, and then the response cannot be ambiguous anymore. So I think that in order for China to decide to use that type of leverage, you need to be very close to a fracture, a very serious fracture, a conflict, And of course, if we're talking about a scenario in which there is a full-fledged conflict between China and the European Union, sure, that is definitely a liability. We can't deny that. But we also need to be aware that, again, it's a globalized world, and you know, we need to balance our concerns with the fact that we can't be entirely protectionist, right? In connected to this, whether the European Union has been doing enough. So the European Union is definitely aware of the situation, mostly fully aware of the situation. And it's just, in terms of the situations like the Port of Sines, is a matter of capital. So it's not that the European Union can invest in a European port. A private enterprise has to come up within Europe and say, I want to invest in this terminal. So there's just that much that Brussels can do. And same, but
they can encourage things to happen.
Yes, exactly. Same for the United States. They can just encourage, but at the end of the day, if there is no enterprises interested, you know, and we have, and you have seen, for example, in the example of Poland, that there are ways to ask for, you know, European capital and use it to develop infrastructure. It's just that it's limited. So even all those plans that have been in the pipelines and that exist now to create alternatives to the BRI, not just in Europe, but globally, have very limited capacity. And a lot has been mentioned in regard to the recovery fund. And I have a feeling that this recovery fund is endless because it pops up everywhere. And I mean, it can't possibly cover all the areas of interest that we mentioned. So yeah, I think more could be done, but I think that the more that could be done needs to be in coordination with the private entities within the European Union, because of how the European market is constructed. It's not just a matter of policies at Brussels level. There needs to be more venture capital. There needs to be more coordination with the private entities. And of course, I'm going to say this usual thing, you know, new industrial policies and competition policies to compete with realities that are much bigger, much stronger, and have a lot more capital.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for the very interesting questions. Your first question is, how representative are the big three of the larger trends in the EU? And I would say they're relatively representative. So of course, these are different scales, but in essence, what you see, the bottom line of the book, essentially, the findings is essentially that you do see some convergence between the big three in terms of how they perceive China, the kind of policy goals they develop, the kind of policy instruments they want to develop. However, you still see that they largely, not only, but very largely rely on national policies to deal with China. Of course, they have tried, including the UK, to foster some greater EU cohesion vis-a-vis China. But still, it remains a largely nationally focused policy. The same can be said across the EU. So I do see some convergence. China is today a big issue, like on the diplomatic agenda for many, many countries, like it was not in the 1990s and 2000, except for the economic domain. However, because of continued diverging security concerns, some countries are more or less concerned. Diverging regional priorities. Some countries are more focused on the Mediterranean or on Russia than on the Asia Pacific. And also because of diverging economic interests, the EU has really struggled. Despite the hype about a lot of recent initiative, I do see still a lot of fragmentation in the EU. And this links to your question on the mechanism, like the EU screening mechanism is precisely, it's a step forward, it's an improvement in the sense that it is a coordination mechanism, but it is an area which is national security related, and therefore states are jealous to cede sovereignty on these very sensitive areas. And you see the same thing in the 5G, essentially. Honestly, in the 5G, you do see diverging policies across the EU. Same thing on BRI. I mean, the list is long. You have some converging trends, but it remains diverging national policies. And honestly, policymakers are quite conscious of that. And this is also why they are concerned that China can exploit these divisions, and they think that the EU should do more, essentially. On the definition of influence, I very much agree with what Francesca Guidetti just said. So I'll basically stick to that, just saying that policymakers I interviewed most of them use examples saying, look, just look at what China did on pressure it exerted when the EU was developing a statement on the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal or on human rights, just as empirical evidence that China does use its economic influence as political leverage. And so this is just used as an example for Chinese influence. And then maybe a word on the question of Giulio on US pressures. I'll take one example, the UK on 5G. The UK had imposed a limited restriction on Huawei, 35% of the networks outside the core of the network. What happened, this was January 2020. In May 2020, the US imposes export controls on Huawei. This has a lot of technical ramifications for the UK, meaning that they cannot, they consider that they could not acquire any more equipment from Huawei, should rely on other sources, which cannot be reliably assessed. And therefore, for purely technical reasons, they decided to impose a ban, okay? But at the same time, the US was exerting huge pressures on the US government. I know from interviews that they were also leaking documents to MPs in the UK. So the MPs was using US classified documents to put pressure on the executive branch. And so you had these twofold pressures. And so essentially the US had an impact on the UK position, both at the technical level and at the political level. So that's the bottom line.
You get us, Sam?
Okay. Yeah. So Giulio, first I want to tackle your question. I think your question was on how the recent US executive order tasking various departments to begin assessing all of these supply chains in critical areas and how this may not fit Japan. But just a point of note, Japan's METI actually already have policies to subsidize Japanese companies to diversify supply chains. And I believe this was implemented in Japan before the US. But I think the broader concern that underpins your question, and this is linked to the last question I received from Liselotte, is what Japan should do when there's a gap between Japan and US interest regarding certain economic security issues. And this isn't a question that's limited to Japan, and all other advanced economies, including European countries, must deal with this. When we think about this issue, I think that the primary concern that all of us have is when US policies to protect technology edges towards industrial protection of US industries. So my recommendation is for Japan to create a web of bilateral economic security dialogue with different advanced countries, but cooperate in different technological areas with them. For instance, Canada is famous for having competitive AI companies work on Japan-Canada AI cooperation. Israel is known as having robust biotechnology companies and cybersecurity. That would be the issue for Japan-Israel bilateral economic security dialogue. Netherlands has world-leading semiconductor manufacturing equipment, Japan-Netherlands cooperation. So I think that Japan should engage in bilateral discussion with these countries in the areas where both countries have competitive critical technology, so that if the United States decides to create regulations or rules that can be seen as needlessly hindering innovation in that area, then Japan, along with other countries with these technologies, can push back on the US. And then I want to move on to Liselotte's first question. On Japan's defensive economic statecraft, it is true that one of the primary impetus for these recent changes in Japan are no doubt due to concerns over China. But if you look at it, the defensive economic statecraft, such as visa restrictions or export control, investment screening, strengthening cybersecurity, these are not simply policies to change Chinese behavior. I mean, it can be any malign actor that's trying to access Japanese technology. So it's really for any malign actors. But once again, yes, all of the policies we have seen so far are defensive in nature. And we've only actually seen a handful of Japanese economic statecrafts that are actually directed specifically at China, which actually continues to my answer on your question on human rights. So on human rights, you asked, do I see a change towards more offensive human rights policies in Japan and perhaps also among some of its Asian neighbors? And there's a similar question from the panel by Marco as well. So I want to take a little bit of time to address this. My quick answer Or my quick optimistic answer is that yes, Japan is changing. Now, there is currently an ongoing debate in Japan regarding how it conducts its human rights diplomacy. Until very recently, and I should say still, one could characterize Japan's human rights related foreign policies as being one of dialogue and cooperation. Implicit in this phrase is, of course, any lack of punitive actions or sanctions. One can actually point to numerous historical cases in Japan to back up this claim, but the most prominent example is probably Japan's diplomatic stance immediately after the Tiananmen Square massacre. The Japanese diplomatic archives for Tiananmen Square massacre was opened last December, and here the document clearly states that the Japanese government has decided to take a reconciliatory policy towards China on the very day that the massacre took place. So we see similar trends even to this day. Take the current situation in Myanmar. The Japanese government has argued that they have a unique diplomatic tie with the key actors in Myanmar, precisely because Japan has not used sanctions towards them. And I mean, I'm wishing every day to see a grand home run from MOFA, that they have utilized their unique position and they have successfully arbitrated an agreement among all parties towards an acceptable denouement. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that to this day. We can also look at China. US, UK, Canada, and EU have actually yesterday all coordinated to engage in an Magnitsky Act style sanctions towards Chinese officials responsible for serious human rights violations that is occurring in Xinjiang. But the Japanese government had so far been reticent. Now, one reason why the Japanese government have been so reticent to these human rights issues is because the Japanese government doesn't have a sanctions tool that can be triggered by human rights violations. There is now, as I talked about in my presentation, a movement in the Diet to introduce a Japanese version of the Magnitsky Act, but the executive branch, the government, have so far been extremely passive on this recommendation. And I mean, this topic is actually worth writing a completely different paper about, and I'm actually currently writing a book on Magnitsky Act and Japan's human rights diplomacy. I also spoke at an international symposium hosted by the University of Tokyo about 2 weeks ago on this very topic, and it's up on YouTube. So please go and watch the video for now. And when my book comes out, please buy it, read it, and that hopefully will give you a better sense of the changing domestic dynamics vis-a-vis its human rights diplomacy.
Thank you, Igata-san. We'll just need to wait for Francesca's book so that the whole panel turns also into a promotional panel for all three speakers. The question that we have from an anonymous attendee is, I would say for all speakers, can we say that Chinese investment has been politicized? I would paraphrase the question. And can we say that it has been securitized? So let's just add up terms. And it has been politicized for sure under the BRI project in terms of debt trap diplomacy or falling into Chinese asymmetries and becoming a pawn of Beijing, but it has also been securitized in terms of the security threats that perhaps are not there. And so I leave that to you. And if that has been the case or not the case, what have been the consequences? Shall we go in the same order? Yeah, Francesca?
Okay, then I'll make a little bit of promotion as well. I'm actually writing my PhD thesis on the securitization of Chinese foreign direct investments.
Fantastic.
So politicized and securitized on a very broad level, yes, both. And definitely the fact that the BRI has given more backlashes, has led to more backlashes than actual promotion of Chinese investments is an example of this. It's just a simple fact that, you know, giving this umbrella to Chinese investments in the world and in the European Union has created a lot more problems than solutions. And politicized is actually a question that I'm asking myself. I don't touch necessarily upon politicization of Chinese foreign direct investments, and I'd be glad to hear what Professor Hugemeyer thinks about this, is whether, you know, politics played a central role in the responses that the countries have given to Chinese investments. In terms of, for example, we see that, you know, when change of governments, you have different responses. In other instances, however, you see that the government didn't change and you still have different responses. So did politics play a central role? And did politics play a central role in shaping the discourse on foreign direct investments? As far as securitization is concerned, and I'll close here, interestingly enough, there are actually much fewer instances of proper securitization, of successful securitization than one would think. So there are a lot of processes that have begun, but in terms of success, not that much. But again, it also depends what we think, what we define as securitization, whether, you know, is linked to economic securitization, to social securitization, military securitization, and so on and so forth. But there has been a more aware security conception of Chinese foreign direct investments than there were, I don't know, 10 years ago, 5 years ago even. Yes, I will conclude here.
Thank you. Ugo?
Yes, on this question of securitization, politicization, so on the securitization, very much so. So one of the arguments of my books and findings essentially is really that since 2009-10, gradually and cumulatively, you've seen a growing securitization of Chinese economic presence on the continent. If by securitization we mean the construction of Chinese investments and economic presence as a security threat or a security challenge. And in that sense, absolutely. And again, I think this has been a key driver of change in the policies across Europe, okay? Now, one point which really emerges from the interviews is that nevertheless, in the past years, all the policymakers in the at least big three capital say, however, there's been a lot of disappointment vis-a-vis BRI across Europe, a lot of promises, less output, and therefore the initial concerns are still there, but they've been slightly tamed by this idea that it was more promises than concrete output. This is what emerges from interview, from my interviews at least. And then on the question of politicization and securitization, what my understanding of it is that the main, again, sorry for the repetition, but the main driver of change of all this has been China's increasingly assertive behavior and growing presence in Europe economically, but the same applies to Asia, is growing assertiveness. And the timing combined is really from 2009, 2010. And so for me, this has been the key driver of change. However, what has sort of differed across countries in the EU has been the timing, the exact timing of reaction in the past decade. So some countries really from 2010 becomes more concerned, and many countries like Germany and the UK is really after 2016 and so forth. So, and the timing and the modalities of this reaction has been shaped very much by the domestic politics and also the bureaucratic infights, okay? So that's how I see it.
Thank you. Akira?
Yeah, thank you. So I think most of them have been answered, so I'll just keep it quick. I think that securitization of BRI is one of the key reasons why the phrase economic security in Japanese, keizai anpo, had suddenly begun appearing in public discourse in the last few years. I mean, you open up a newspaper, which I guess none of us do every day. So whenever you click on the news websites, there's never a day in Japan when this word keizai anpo doesn't appear. I mean, there's at least 2 or 3 articles every single day talking about this. And this is because China's BRI has been securitized. And of course, many of the other Chinese policies, including influence operation, has been securitized. Its human rights violation and its counter to those policies has been securitized. I feel like everything that China does is now becoming securitized in Japanese discourse. This is also partly why one of my 6 recommendations has been on doubling down on the Blue Dot network. I mean, it's a great idea, but its potential remains to be unfilled. And I think that the International Development Finance Corporation that was formed to strengthen US capacity by consolidating various US agencies tasked with overseas aid have been or should be taking the lead. And I really hope that the Biden administration will task this newly formed DFC to take leadership in reinvigorating the Blue Dot network, and that both Japan and Australia invest more political capital and actual capital funds in providing alternatives to BRI.
Thank you, Igata-san. We have a provocative question from one of the former panelists, Hosuke Lee Makiyama, director of ICIPE. And the question is about the European Union's economic coercion. How does the European Union's economic coercion materially differ from China's? And by economic coercion, I imagine that he's referring to the leverage that the European Union uses in terms of market access and of its own substantial trade and market area. And how does it differ from China, aside from the audacity and legitimacy of its objectives? Some might argue that they are largely working with similar tools of lobbying. So lobbying is not coercion, right? There is a different definition in the question too, in a sense, to behavior. Offering of selective incentives or market exclusion for influence. And again, the goals may well be different. And I think Ugo would like to take the question, please.
Sure, just a few words. First of all, in the panel, we spoke really about influence rather than coercion, Chinese influence rather than coercion, which are indeed, as Giulio points out, different things. First of all, honestly, I don't see very much economic coercion from the EU vis-a-vis China yet, at least. For decades, EU policymakers at the EU and national level did not really think about economic tools as tools of statecraft. Again, the relationship was really largely shaped through an economic lens. And the difference also is the variety of capitalism, essentially. It is really the role of the states in Chinese capitalism, which is both in state-owned companies and in private companies, actually, because it's a direct and indirect influence of the states in the companies, which is a central area of concern for the Europeans. There is the relationship between the state and the firms from the EU perspective is quite different. So this is, for me, well, my answer is basically, first of all, it's very different variety of capitalism. And secondly, only very, very recently have Europeans come to think of economic tools as elements of statecraft in their relation with China, I would say.
If I may add as well.
Great.
There's
not just vis-a-vis China, if I may, you know, in terms of how Europe leverage.
In general, the European market is open. So it's open to most investments, it's open to most trade. And of course, you have certain, and increasingly so, protective measures. And vis-a-vis China, you had, for example, previously the market economy status debate. But generally speaking, it's quite open. So first of all, I agree with Professor Hugomeyer. Coercion is a bit of a strong word in both cases. And secondly, it's a relatively open market. So I don't see where the question comes from.
Can I also add a point?
Yes, and if possible, could you also refer to potential coercive means, if at all, that Japan may employ? Thank you.
Sure. So as I've said, we've just had the EU impose EU Magnitsky Act against China, and the Chinese government actually retaliated by sanctioning politicians and academics and think tanks who has been voicing concerns over human rights violations. And I think that including these examples, Chinese economic coercion is qualitatively different from the general economic statecraft that democratic countries engages in. For instance, there have been numerous cases, most recently, Australia has been hit with the export ban of wine, its meat. Canada was also banned with exporting canola oil to China. Norway has been banned to sell its salmon to China. All of this for political reasons, and I can go on and on with different examples of banana in the Philippines, or the rare earth materials in Japan, or all of these hair appliances from South Korea for getting the THAAD missile and so on. So once again, I think we should be very careful in equating all of these kind of arbitrary use of economic coercion with just a general economic statecraft where states use economics as a tools to pursue certain goals. And then on the possibilities of Japan imposing certain sanctions towards China. If Japan stays put in its traditional mode of diplomacy, then I don't think we'll be seeing any type of Japanese sanctions towards China in the near future. Yet I think we are really now in the midst of really debating whether or not Japan should change. And so I think you have to wait to see whether or not Japan stays the same or changes.
Thank you. On this happy note about the EU's intrinsic difference, but of course, if we have to show a lesson to somebody, as has been the case with Brexit, clearly we did leverage a bit of, I wouldn't say coercion, but we did leverage our market access, and of course, there was also good reason for internal EU polity union, I would imagine. But on this note, and I'm cynical very much like Hosuk is, I am delighted to let all of you know that we have finished on time. And we have the chance to let all of you know that we have been delighted to have you throughout the way. That this is just the beginning of the EU-Asia project, and that this will be an ongoing conversation. We are delighted to be hosted by the Global Governance Program within the Robert Schuman Center, because as this Kickstart conference has made clear, this engagement between Europe and Asia, with a specific eye on East Asia and of course Japan, will not just look at hard security and politics, which unfortunately has been very much the preoccupation of us all nowadays, with the US-China confrontation deepening still. But by really leveraging, if we might, our expertise within the Robert Schuman Center in aspects such as trade and economics, to have a rounder perspective really on EU's engagement with Asia. And this, we are delighted, both I can speak for sure also for the co-lead of the project, Ken Endo from Hokkaido University and EUI, will build up more and more momentum. And we will look forward to have all of the papers, all of the presentations turn into policy papers within the next 2 months. And stay tuned on YouTube, the Global Governance Program, and stay tuned also within the social media channels of the EUI, because we will have lots and lots of events, public lectures, and papers that will be churned out, and we look forward to involving a wider crowd. And On that note, let me say goodbye. Let me reiterate my thanks to the speakers and say good afternoon and good evening to all of you, or good morning if you're tuning in from America. Bye-bye.